Chapter 2 The Mad Beliefs. There is a superstition in avoiding superstition. Francis Bacon. Do not believe in witches, warned a widely used elementary textbook of 1895. People who say they can steal or work harm by muttering certain words, those who claim to know the future, are madmen and thieves. Or thieves. Do not believe in ghosts, in specters, in spirits, in phantoms. Do not imagine one can avoid harm or accidents with amulets, talismans, fetishes, such as herbs gathered on St. John's Eve. If Ernst Lavize warned against such beliefs, it must have been because they were widespread. Others agreed. For the least little reason, the peasant thought a spell had been cast on his cattle or his field. He bought talismans and wore them around his neck like a scapulary, medallions, magic rings, a piece of hangman's rope, saw the devil's hand in anything out of the way, and ran to a sorcerer. In 1880, Émile Lettre thought that the word charme was being used less in its primitive sense of spell, and that even the reciting or singing of incantatory spells was on the wane. But spells and prayers for protection against devils or storms, snakes or mad dogs, seemed in no hurry to disappear. As late as 1908 we find the belief current that a hunter's gun would be charmed if he shot at a cross and drew blood from it. In 1892 an agricultural commission visiting Roquefort in the Landes was shocked at the hold of superstition there. The small farmers did not want beehives because they brought bad luck. Branches of fern to ward off the evil eye hung from the roof of every sheepfold. The Bourbonnais had long believed in the efficacy of the Marcou, the eldest of 7 sons born consecutively, who was supposed to be able to heal scrofula by simply touching the victim before sunrise on the night of St. John. Marcou drew great crowds in Bourbonnais until the end of the century and were paid for their help in kind. They continued to be called on still later in Beauce. Well into the 20th century in Berry, everything was of fearsome or fantastic portent. The buzzing of insects announced a ghostly hunt. The ribbons of mist above the marshes were mysterious drivers of clouds. Newly pruned elms, shadows, or haze turned into sinister fancies. The moonlight was crowded with goblins, sprites, elves, imps, wraiths, will-o'-the-wisps, werewolves, leprechauns, trolls, boogeymen, white ladies, ghostly huntsmen, and occasionally even giants, offspring of the prodigious creatures who had left the looming menhirs and dolmens where they now stood. Fairy rings marked places where wood sylphs trod. The pack of the black huntsman bayed in the wind. Penitent souls roamed the fields, or waited at the crossroads. Forest guards or gamekeepers to whom St. Peter closed his gates as he did to bailiffs, or priests condemned to wander until they said every last mass they had been paid to say during their lifetime, and had left unsaid. Many local spirits had been helpful, playful, and occasionally mischievous beings until the Church spread the notion that they were evil. They could turn dangerous if surprised, but peasant tales also contain fairies who build castles, open roads, and repair broken tools. In early 19th century Nivernais, when a plough broke, a peasant could still invoke the fairies' aid and leave 12 souls by their, that's SOLS, that's probably a currency, by their rock to pay for it. In any case, they were a familiar part of life, so much so that in the Morvan, Melusine was known as Le Mère Louison. Interwoven with current experience, the supernatural was adapted to it, and sometimes in a very purposeful way, as in 1842, when robbers in a village of the Doubs Valley disguised themselves as devils to cover their foray into the night to rob a cattle dealer. Breton fairies seem to have worn the same grey canvas that salt smugglers wore, and dwelt in the same cliffside caves. In the Alps, too, mid-century smugglers used local superstitions to explain their mysterious lights and keep the curious at a respectful distance. In Yonne, the Puisais long remembered the sinister Bérets, who in the guise of werewolves, covered with skins, howling and dragging long chains, devastated fields and gardens in the 1880s, and various mythical ogres, probably derived from Uyghurs and Hungarians, personified the devastating brigands of living memory. Superstition survived for a long time. In the Limousin of the 1880s, though the peasants' dread of ghosts and werewolves had dwindled, they still feared the effects of the stranger's evil eye on the cattle in their stable, and still scared easily at night. People sang on the way to and from Velay, probably to scare off spirits. The devil does hate singing. In the 1860s, Prosper Mérimée noted the peasants' belief that the levels and other surveying equipment used by engineers in the building of canals and railroads caused droughts. In 1895, the inhabitants of Pont-Neuf-Pré in Finestre found a siren dying on their beach and gave her a Christian burial, only to have the priest disinter the corpse and throw it into the sea. When in the trenches of the First World War, a Vendean soldier told of his father's seeing a guerreau, in his case a man changed into a sheep at night and back again at dawn, his fellows from Mayenne doubted not that there was such a thing, but that the father could still have seen one. There are things from the olden days. It is a good 60 to 70 years since they have been seen. For all that, the old folk tales still had sufficient force, as late as 1906, to frighten the 12-year-old brother of Jacques Duclos, who thought he saw something in the yard in the dark of night, and came in, trembling with fear, to be sick forthwith. The dark was literally fearful. Revealingly, in Languedoc, the ghosts and other spirits that were cloaked in obscurity were known by the generic name frights, pou or poos, and as a Tarn proverb declared, but for the frights, the priests would die of hunger. Perhaps, like the wolves with another modern invention, the spirits could be dispersed only by electrification. But it does seem that as old people died, imps and trolls and fairies deserted the countryside. Sorcerers held fast, kings and priests pass away, mused Emile Silvestre after 1848. But witches survive. Cases of witchcraft appear in the courts at least into the 1870s, some serious, as when in 1863 in Ardennes, brickmaker had a sorcerer murdered for having cast a spell on his brick kilns, or when a young couple of Solognots were executed in 1887 for murdering the wife's mother on a sorcerer's advice, then burning the corpse to eliminate her evil spirit. Less tragically, in 1883, the priest of Nongs-sur-Beuvron, Loire-et-Cher, recorded the encounter between one of his flock and a coven of witches at a Sabbath, who fled at the sign of the cross. Everyone could be a witch. Anyone might be one, especially strangers and those who lived on the fringes of the community, like shepherds. Above all, though, the sorcerer was a person who had books, or notes taken from books, with esoteric formulas and incantations. Grimoires, from grammar, in this case, something learned and obscure, were still sold in Bourbonnais in 1908 in their characteristic sexto-decimo format with colored paper bindings and illustrations. Country people would ask the small-town bookseller for livres de sorcelage, especially those whose magic was strongest. On vous trouvera tout ce que sont les plus fortes. The most powerful books were popular corruptions of the medieval science of Albertus Magnus, Le Grand and Le Petit Albert. Copies of these works were rare, sorcerers were proud to own one, and, of course, the big was more powerful than the little. People were terrorized by those known to have a copy, though ownership had its hazards, since one could not die until he had been passed on to someone else. In the mid-20th century, in the Tarn, a man remembered his parents' warning never to accept a Grand Albert, because you will never be able to get rid of it. The prediction had a way of turning out to be self-fulfilling. In 1951, at Razay, in Che, a family found a copy of the dread work in the loft, and tried to burn it. Damp and moldy, it would not catch fire, from which miraculous preservation the conclusion was drawn that it must not be touched again. On the other hand, a book of spells brought good luck. Even today, the Morvan Dieu will say a man for whom things work out well, he has the Petit Albert in his pocket. Priests, perhaps, because they had even more books than sorcerers, were more powerful still. In the 1850s, a Limousin priest reclaimed his parish from the slough of indifference and Protestantism, into which it had fallen by patient argument and hard campaigning, but also by miracles and healings that reinforced his reputation for wisdom. Priests could bring rain or fine weather, and through the 19th century, curés were required to participate in the rites designed to secure these, at least in the diocese of Autun and Nevers. At Viglaine, in Loiret, the priest got 20 fleeces and 20 measures of wheat, worth about 60 francs of the day, for reading the Lord's Passion every single Sunday, and in the case of a storm both day and night to assure nature's bounty. In 1880, the surplice of a priest near Arlouf in the Nièvre burst into flames as he was performing his rites of sympathetic magic. Of Bourbonnais, where faith in tarot cards ran strong in the early 1900s, a folklorist noted, in many parishes people are certain, that their priests carry the great tarot game in his long sleeves, and that he knows how to tell fortunes from it. It is for this reason that many country people attribute so much knowledge and learning to him. A priest could cast a charm on storms and defy hail. He could throw his hat over his parish to protect it, symbolically covering it, or cast a shoe against the storm cloud to drive it off, symbolically kicking it away. Some priests were good for hail. Many were not. Though priests who refused to use their powers to drive off a storm or make one break risked the beating, people understood that a young priest might not be wise enough to know these secrets and generally sought an older, experienced man for their parish. At the same time, it was important to beware of a curé who had the gift, but whose powers had been worn down, so that his masses had no force. Ces messieurs ayant peu de force. Masses and other religious rites played a role in several kinds of magic, designed to bless, to exorcise, to heal, to put an end to a torment or bring one on. Messe de tormentation. The most effective measure, if one could bring it off, was said to be the triangular mass, Messe en pied de chèvre, in which the priests of 3 churches formed a triangle, all recited the mass at roughly the same time. Most priests were reluctant to lend themselves to such practices, but they generally could be maneuvered into taking part in them unwittingly. In any case, just touching a priest or his vestments was often sufficient to bring results, and of course the higher his rank, the greater his power. In 1881, the new Inspector General of Primary Education in Lozère was shaken to find the supreme importance, the people in the region of Mende, attached to contact with the robe of a prelate on circuit for healing the sick. Most peasant cottages kept a reserve of holy water brought from church on Easter Eve or Candlemas, in a special basin or pitcher to use as protection for buildings and crops, and in an emergency to baptize a stillborn child or sprinkle a corpse. An English wayfarer through the Conseil of Quercy in 1894 was intrigued to see bottles of holy water placed on top of chimneys as protection against lightning. Crosses, often woven of straw and wreathed with flowers, or palm leaves, or their local substitutes, or both, surmounted the door, after having been passed 3 times through the flames of the midsummer pyre, or been blessed on Palm Sunday. These too were a capital defense against lightning, as well as against more intangible evils, and where, as in most places, hatred of the Lord's hunting survived in tales of satanic riders, red, black, damned gaillards, that passed at night and that charcoal burners had special cause to fear. The priest made a point of going out to bless their lonely huts. Prominent in the uncertain ground between religion and magic stood foundations, wells, springs, and bells. We shall meet the watering places presently, when we turn to religious practices. For now let us simply that in general they played a crucial role for people who found it difficult to understand and dominate their bodies, minds, and physical surroundings. The fame of various spots waxed or waned, a few were even forgotten, but miraculous fountains, as such, retained their popularity throughout the 19th century. Some must have looked like Japanese temple groves, with votive rags, ribbons, and articles of clothing draped over them and over all the surrounding growth. And some clearly benefited from the growing prosperity of their devotees, reflected in their convenient installations or monumental decorations such as those contrived in Brittany. This cult of good fountains, which is still to be found, declined at least in the center, the west, and the southwest after the turn of the century, and most notably in the First World Wars. Only local residents and old people still used them after that. As an old woman told an inquiring visitor to the healing springs at Sanguinet, Lond, since the war began, no more rags on the bushes. The war stops everything. It did not stop the ringing of church bells against storms. The Carillon du Tonnerre was banned by civil and ecclesiastical authorities in the 18th century, and condemned by all public powers throughout the 19th. In guerre, prefectorial decrees followed one another in 1813, 1839, and 1855, and so did the official requests for still more decrees, indicating how ineffective all the decrees were. It's bureaucracy for you there. An official ecclesiastical survey of the 500 guerre parishes in 1840 found the practice in all but 14. Another, carried out in 1956, showed that in 194 of the 337 parishes responding, the custom had been abandoned, but that 143 still sounded the bells whenever storms threatened or broke. 1956, folks. One important reason why priests and public powers opposed the practice was that it threatened the life of the ringer. In 1783 alone, lightning struck 386 belfries in France and killed 121 bell ringers. With lightning rods, the massacre diminished, but not in isolated departments like Ardèche, where one bell ringer was killed by lightning in Balbiac in 1874, and another at Grospierre the following year. Yet in 1878, when the bell ringer in a parish near L'Argentier refused to do his duty in a storm, 2 drones took his place and saved the fields from the hail that devastated neighboring parishes. Like the bell in Montmorillon, Vienne, which was still rung after the First World War and perhaps after, many church bells spelled out what their major purpose was. A fulguribus et tempestate libera nos domine. Okay. Throughout Mâconnais and Bourbonnais, as in other regions, mayors hesitated to enforce the official injunctions against bell ringing, well knowing that their people would turn against them as readily as they turned against priests who tried to prevent the practice. In the 1890s, Edward Harrison Barker referred to the ringing as an old custom that was dying out, yet he encountered it in the Drôme Valley as he passed through. And Henri Polge tells us that in 1908, in order to get back at the regular bell ringer, who had refused to ring the church bells on July 14th, the municipal council of the Garde appointed a second man, specially charged with ringing in case of danger from hail. The ringing bells brought comfort to those who heard them, allayed anxiety, made them feel less helpless. They gave people something to do, or to think they were doing, when there was nothing they could do. The logic behind the pealing that evil might be frightened away, made sense even if it did not work. Impotence devised its own defenses. The strategy of impotence, that is, magic, was based on a primitive unity of objects and beings. That obscure and profound unity Baudelaire sang of his correspondences. Nature is a temple, wherein living columns will sometimes let slip a confused utterance. Man crosses it with great hosts of symbols, casting upon him a familiar glance. The poem, frankly, describes language in general, actually. It's good. Modern thought isolated and segregated objects and beings. Objective units, the tree, the bell, the storm, had served as substitutes for subjective conceptions of vaster wholes formed on anthropomorphic lines, and hence susceptible of symbolic manipulation. A linear vision of space and time replaced the maze of privileged places, trees, rocks, springs, and moments, like solstices, or the solstice, or All Saints, that concentrated in themselves the very forces of life. Modern man could no longer communicate with the world by proceeding through ritual form to magic essence. Experience now taught, and school taught too, that magic specificity and totalism were misleading. They would be replaced by abstractions far, far removed from limited everyday experience, but only when everyday experiences ceased to be so limited. Is the supernatural that life behind, to which the Auvergnat Pascal referred, la vie de derrière, where men seek refuge from the visible life before them? Or is it simply a reflection of the conditions of that prosaic world, a collection of suggested solutions for the problems of everyday life? Lightning came to be tamed, cattle healed, health improved, remedies were found for snakebite and for rabies. Weather bulletins proved more reliable than astrological formulas or ancient spells, and fields were fattened by chemicals, but old practices survived, and especially where marriage, childbirth, and death were concerned. Fountains that promised love or marriage lasted longer than those with healing waters. Fertility rites and funeral customs persisted beyond the First World War. Those parts of life that are the most difficult to dominate, that are the most contingency prone, retained their magic aspects the longest.